This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
All right, boys and girls, thanks for coming back to the Football Odyssey. This is your host, Aron Harris. On today's show, I'm joined by Branden Buehler. Branden is an assistant professor at Seton Hall University whose research centers around sports media, with a particular focus on sports television and sports media industries. Branden and I discuss his 2016 journal article, Manufacturing Football Realism in the Studio Era, that focuses on the efforts of Warner Brothers to create realistic football action in their films, and we conclude by talking about the interesting future of sports programming. I've attached a link in the description to Branden's website where you can read all of his articles mentioned in the episode. So without further ado, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Branden Buehler. All right, Branden Buehler, thank you for joining us today. How's it going, man?
Oh, it's going well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for taking the time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Happy to join in and talk the topic.
Yeah, man. I first had heard about your essay, which I think was written in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's Manufacturing Football Realism in the Studio Era. And I've discovered it, I think, in 2019, and it was always in my reading list. And finally, I got around to checking it out. And I thought it was really intriguing, both as a football fan and as a film fan. But before we go really deeper into it, can you give the audience a little bit of a background as to your sports fandom and your career in academia and how you came to focus on sports media in particular?
Yeah, so my background is I've generally followed a kind of academic trajectory going from undergrad to grad school. And I started grad school wanting to study film and media and wanting to be a film studies professor. And one thing I noticed while I was getting my PhD in film and media studies was, as I started, exploring more of the scholarship, what was out there, I noticed that there was not a lot of film and media scholarship, particularly on sports media. And so even though that wasn't necessarily my original intention in terms of specialization, just as I started noticing the absence of a really critical analysis of particularly things like sports television, sports radio, sports video games, you name it, basically any sports media form, there wasn't a lot of critical analysis of it out there. I started kind of veering in that direction. And so, kind of built on a lifelong interest in sports media, but it was kind of unexpected as I got further into graduate school to go in that direction of just basically responding to, there's, all this sports television out there that so many people watch, sports films that are incredibly popular, sports video games that are huge global franchises, and just not a lot of, academic scholarship out there on it. So started going more in that direction. And then here I am now as a professor of film and media studies, but one who specializes in particularly doing sports media research. So an unintended path originally, but eventually has led to where I am now.
Why do you think there's been a lack of scholarship regarding sports media?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, coming out of film and media studies, a background that comes out of a lot of disciplines, but things like English and cultural studies, I think there's long been a perception of, well, originally there's within those disciplines, generally there's not, there's been a long push to embrace the study of popular media forms that have long been seen as kind of lower forms of culture. And so there's a long kind of historical academic battle to include television within media studies, originally coming out of more the specialty in film. And so the kind of the more recent now inclusion of more sports media scholarship in, I'm doing this, but there are also other scholars out there who are now more writing about sports media. I think there's been just more generally over the last couple of years, this push to recognize the importance of that, but there's been this broader kind of addressing of the popular and things that have long been dismissed as kind of more lowbrow, more like material for the couch potato and thus not deserving of scrutiny. But I think that's there's been increasing recognition that that low status is constructed in that all this material is worth really analyzing, recognizing. There's so much significance to how these sports media texts are operating ideologically in terms of their reverberations through culture and society. And so there's been some shift of late, but I think this longer push against this dismissal of this kind of fare as unimportant, of like pedestrian, of not worth.
Yeah, from a football perspective, Michael Oriard, from my knowledge, was one of the first that kind of touched on the idea of studying sports media critically. And I know you had included him in your manufacturing football realism paper, how he talked about the golden age of football coincided with the golden age of cinema and how it wasn't really a coincidence. So can you touch on for the audience how the two histories were intertwined in the beginning?
Yeah, well, if you go back, well, this is kind of gets into the broader history of thinking about the sports film kind of as a genre. And if you go back all the way to the emergence of cinema, like the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s, sport has always been a huge part of cinema. You can go back to the silent film era, and like all the silent film comedians, the slapstick comedians like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd. They're all making sports related films. And so there's this close connection historically between sport and film. And just basically, as long as there's been film, there's been basically a recognition of its big role in culture, and thus a recognition of a great source material for film. And so you start to see really the emergence over the course of the early 20th century, kind of the outlines of a sports film genre. Going back to the silent era, you start to see kind of those formulas start to emerge, all those things that we're used to now, where football films, there's the Hail Mary at the end, like a pass, will they catch it? Will they, won't they, walk off as victors, and, all these sorts of templates we're used to. They start emerging early in the 20th century with silent film. And so what that means then is, as you get into the classical studio era of filmmaking, really here talking about often the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, you see really the sports film emerging as really this really popular kind of subject matter, and you see the sports film emerge as a kind of a recognizable genre. But intriguingly, at this point, if you go back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s, generally, we're now used to today talking about the sports film. We kind of group them all together in many ways. You'll talk about Field of Dreams alongside Any Given Sunday. They're all just kind of sports films, and that's the way they tend to get tagged. But if you go back to the studio era, they tended to be separated out by sport genre. And so you'd have football films, for example, you'd have baseball films, you'd have boxing films, you'd have horse racing films. And each of those form their own kind of little template in and of themselves. And so all that is to say is, there are a lot of sports films during this era, during the studio era, when the big Hollywood studios were pumping out tons and tons of films. There are tons of sports films, but in particular, the football film is one of the most popular subgenres here, particularly in relation to sport. And so over the course of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there are tons of football films, particularly a lot set, particularly within college football. And so this is part of the paper I got into, is looking at some of the production side of some of these football films that were just being churned out in huge numbers during this period. And then you can get into, if you start talking about the longer history of the sports film genre, then you start getting later into the 20th century, you start merging them all together, and then you see the genre kind of ebb and flow. But during that studio era of the 20s, 30s, 40s, you certainly saw the sports films, and in particular the football film, having a lot of success. And there's a lot of, you can think here contextually all these other reasons that went into this. Like, for example, you didn't have sports television yet as a ubiquitous technology. And so oftentimes the best, sporting content was to be found in the theaters, even in, narrative fiction films. That's where you could get some sporting content.
Well, yeah, and the you mentioned this in your paper how they would actually show newsreels of football games, college football games from however many weeks ago. So I thought that was interesting how it kind of seems, even though it may not have been a football film that the viewers were watching, they still got a little bit of football as sort of like that viewing experience that kind of cultivated that fandom, I guess you could say, in all areas of the country.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, those newsreels that would come attached to films are kind of like the early version of sports television. I mean, you can listen live to sports radio, but to see things filmed, I mean, those newsreels were your kind of avenue in, as were the fiction films, like the ones that I mentioned in this article, like a New Rockney All American. I mean, that's a way of kind of seeing sporting action filmed.
Yeah. And now the idea of realism, and you talk about how the concept of it can kind of, or the definition can fluctuate a little bit, and it can certainly fluctuate as the viewer's interpretation of it or their definition kind of changes over time. So, how would you kind of articulate realism to someone who is trying to find realistic movies? And also, do you think it's something that you have to kind of define based off the genre that you're talking about?
Yeah, so realism is one of the trickier concepts within film theory, film and media theory more broadly. We're used to, if you go to a movie, you talk about, you get out, you immediately say, I hated it because it was unrealistic, or I loved it, it was so realistic. I mean, it's one of those first kind of things we go to when we're immediately see a piece of film or television that we have a reaction to, is turning to that language of realism. And I find this a lot with my students when they're writing, for example, film and television analysis papers. They'll put in things that, like, oh, this film is a masterwork of genius because it's so realistic. But then what, I often ask the students to do is to push a little bit and say, well, what do you mean by it was so realistic? What exactly did you mean by that? What reality was it connecting to? What signaled this connection to the real? And when you start pushing on realism, we're all kind of like a sense of what's realistic, what's not realistic if we're watching a film or a TV show. But when you start pushing on it, it gets a little fuzzy. What exactly we're talking about when we talk about something being realistic. And what that starts to speak to is realism really being a media construct, particularly in the context of film and television. And so you think about, for example, the way, location filming feels more real often than filming in a studio. But you push on that, like, well, why is that? I mean, if there's still real people in the locations, I mean, what kind of signals this connection to the real? And so one of the things I got into in this paper, Manufacturing Football Realism, is the way that media constructions of realism and the way that audiences conceive of realism shifts over time. And so the realism that we conceive of today is not necessarily the realism that audiences might have had in the 1970s or the 1940s or early in the 20th century. And so that was one of the things that really first got me interested in this paper. Was I started going into the Warner Brother archives, which were across the street from the University of Southern California, where I was getting my PhD. I started going in the archives there, and I was looking in all the boxes of memos and documents, all these papers that they have around the football films. The Warner Brothers archive, they hold on to all the paperwork from the studio executives and the film crew, all these people, and they compile it all in and save it later. I got into the archives and I was looking through these boxes of the football films, and I was noticing all these memos. I mean, a huge portion of these memos were all concerned with this matter of realism. And all these studio executives, the people who are working on the film, the producers, the other executives who are higher up in the studio, they all wanted to offer super realistic films. Mm-hmm. And this was such a huge portion of what their attention was on creating these realistic films that audiences would respond to and come out of the theater saying, wow, that was so realistic, the football action I just watched in the film. But this starts to get into the nature of realism as a construct, because one thing that I found was interesting was all these memos of these films that were made in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. All these executives are like, oh, we got to make the most realistic film possible. Here's all the things we're going to do to make these films as realistic as possible so the audiences find this football action as realistic as possible. I was then looking at modern reactions to these films, including in scholarship, and noting how many contemporary audience members now look back at these films from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, these football films, like A New Rockney All-American, and they look at the football action and they say, this film is so unrealistic. Particularly the football action is so unrealistic. And so you see then this real divergence over time of how audience members conceive of what makes for realism, in particular, in this case, the specific example of what makes for, in particular, quote unquote, realistic sporting action on these film, these film football sequences. And there's these great variations over time in terms of what makes for that realism. So what might have seemed realistic sporting action to an audience member in the 20s, 30s, and 40s differs from a contemporary conception of that realism. And so one of the kind of the smaller arguments I get into the paper, which kind of builds out of media theory, is that there's no one realism. We shouldn't say that these films are less realistic than football films produced today. We shouldn't say that New Rockney All-American is less realistic than Any Given Sunday. They're just working with different conceptions of what's realistic and working with different kind of audience expectations of how to present realistic sporting action. And then so what a lot of the paper is about is getting into how those executives in particularly the 20s, 30s, and 40s define that realism, how they tried to offer realistic action and what audiences were looking for in terms of that realism, which might feel a little bit different than the realism today.
But do you think that the idea that the movie back then didn't have realistic football action may also be rooted in some sort of ignorance as to how the game was actually played back then? Because for me, have you ever seen the movie Saturday's Hero?
No.
It's from 1951. It's about the undersided part of college football. And that to me is like one of the most authentic and best football actions that I've seen. And obviously they're running a very different kind of offense and they have very different personnel and physiques back then. So do you think maybe some of it is just them not being aware of the way the game was played back then? Or is there another reason that they cite for not having realistic football action from their perspective?
Yeah, I mean, some of it might have to do with some discrepancies in terms of the way that the sport itself has evolved over time. I mean, particularly if you go back and you look at, a film like New Rockney All-American, it's filmed, in the studio era, but it's even depicting football from, earlier in the 20th century,
mm-hmm.
and getting into a little periodization there. So, I do think there's probably some jarring discrepancies there, but I also think it gets into, like, for example, the way things are filmed.
Yeah.
And so if you look at like sporting action now fitting with cinema more generally, you see like a really short average shot length. And so if you have, a football sequence and any given Sunday sticks out of my mind because I was just rewatching it for one of my classes a couple of weeks ago. But if you look at any one of the sequences, you'll notice that there's really rapid editing in any of the football scenes. You basically are going shot, like every second is a new shot.
Sure.
And that's what we expect out of cinema. Over the course of the 20th century, shot length has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. The average shot length of a film now being less than 2 seconds in many cases, whereas if you go back early in the 20th century, it was like 4 or 5, 6 seconds, depending on the film you're talking about. And so, you go back to an earlier film, it's really jarring how slow they feel just because they're not editing as quickly. And so even something like that, I think, triggers some of that action feeling less realistic, because you go back and you watch some of these football sequences that are in some of these films from earlier in the 20th century, they just kind of hold on these shots and it feels less filmic then, and it feels then a little jarring. And so editing is one thing, but there are all these other formal things that go into it too, like camera angles, for example.
Sure.
And so again, like you look at something like Any Given Sunday, we now expect a lot of the sporting action in our football films to be super tight. And so to be close in on the ball and on the players. And part of that then, can conceal For example, if you have players who maybe are, stunt doubles and extras, who maybe aren't, skilled professional athletes, if you, if you, use all these tight camera angles on their movements on the field, you're not going to notice as much that maybe they're not moving like a professional athlete. Maybe they're not moving like someone who's played football their entire life. So we have this very certain expectation of what a football scene looks like. But again, you go back to early 20th century, you get a much wider shot fitting with the broader conventions of how films were shot at the time. But I think that too, if you go back as a contemporary audience and you look at it, even just beyond the football action itself, it feels now, just based on the cinematic grammar, those football sequences feel a little off. And that then you might notice a little bit more, some of the the way that these are actors, in these parts. But again, that's what the expectation would have been. That's what audiences were used to. That's what a football sequence looked like at the time. And so you get, the sport itself changed, but also just the whole way that the sport is filmed within movies has changed over time.
Yeah, I definitely want to circle back on that point, but in terms of like the desire for realism, where was that rooted in for the audience? Because it seems like I think people would look at movies as a sort of escapist art form. I mean, maybe that at the time they didn't necessarily approach it that way, but where did the desire for realism come from in terms of sports movies, in particular football? But was this also something that was expected for all sports films?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I really think this has been a huge part of the genre over its entire history. And you go back to the early 20th century across the genres. If you look at these memos from the studio executives, they would very explicitly mention audiences are looking for realistic sporting action. They would explicitly mention that the audiences are going to have, high demands. They're going to be, looking at this with quite a high level of scrutiny. And obviously that's continued to this day. You'll often still react to a sports film by, again, that's one of the first things you'll see in like critical reviews of any given sporting film is, the football looked awful, or, the baseball, looked, super awkward and right, unrealistic. And so it's been part of this history, but I do think some of the contextual factors that drive that search for realism have changed over time. Now, some of the studio executives that, they kind of allude to, if you go and you look at films from the 20s and 30s, this is the audience, this is, their rare taste of filmed football. And so they had a high bar for what they, were getting when they came in, because they were used to watching in person. And now they wanted the filmed action to look, good as well. And so they had a high bar in terms of, making sure that the filmed football sequences looked as good as what they were seeing when they went to the stadium. Mm-hmm. Some scholars have noted recently now, kind of a twist on this, but ending in a similar point, that now we're so used to watching sport on television, and we're so used to being kind of consumed by all these conventions around sports television, that has made the bar very high for if we watch, for example, a football film like a Friday Night Lights or an Any Given Sunday, that we're looking for the action to match what we see on TV. Yeah. And so it's kind of funny, over the course of the 20th century, the context has changed a lot. The bar has gone from, we want to make sure what they're getting in the film is as good as what they're getting in person. So now we want to make sure what they're getting on film is as good as what they're seeing on TV. But in both cases, these expectations are being drawn to what audience members are experiencing elsewhere, and making sure the football they're getting on screen on the big screen in the film theater is what's kind of aligned with what they're getting in other places. And so some of these what they're comparing it to might have changed, but either way, there's a comparison point. And so either way, you have the filmmakers trying to match those comparison points.
Yeah, well, as you were talking, it kind of makes me wonder too, that because this was before television, is this also something that people, you only get to see it live pretty much at that point? So if you do want to see it outside of a live experience, you also wanted to replicate the real thing because of how much you appreciate the actual product.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the fact that the studio executive, there's a lot can be drawn out of the fact that these comparison points have changed over time. And the fact is the studio executives in the 20s and 30s were talking about replicating what audience members were getting in person if they went to, the University of Michigan Stadium and watched a game, and then making sure the football film kind of, matched that, lends credence to, sort of the why they might favor a really wide shot, why they might, favor, not editing as much. It fit the broader cinematic grammar of the time, but it also kind of fit with what that in-person experience was like. Whereas now the comparison point being sports television also fits. It's not just the cinematic grammar has changed, but also the comparison points changed. If we watch sporting action in a contemporary football film, we're expecting shots to be closer in because that's what we see on TV. We're expecting slow motion replay because that's what we get on TV. So it's not just, the broader cinematic grammar has changed, but as those comparison points have changed, I think that's also affected how we filter the way we see the sport.
Yeah. And you mentioned how in retrospect, you look at the football action, say it's unrealistic, but you could also look at that from the production standpoint too. When you look at some of the contemporary reviews that were written at the time, around like 1940, or going back to Over the Goal and a College Coach in the 30s, was the strife among the audience and the critics the actual football sequences themselves, or was it more towards the production aspect?
I mean, it's really notable if you go back and you look at reviews from these movies that came out in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, how much the reviews emphasized in particular the sports sequences, the action sequences, and how much they really looked at the game itself being played. And so I mentioned in the article, there films that came out in the 1920s where the reviewers panned it. They said the football itself didn't make any sense. Like the play calls, like people being wide open. It's kind of the same thing, you see, it feels like so long ago, but it's the same thing you hear films today being ding dong. So like, I know that I was talking to people recently about the Mighty Ducks TV show that came on to Disney Plus about hockey, and talking about the Mighty Ducks film, and how one of the reasons it can be hard to watch is the hockey doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
The defense disappears. It's basically gone. And just none of the actual action makes sense. But, reviewers were looking and dissecting the sporting action in the very, very similar way in the 1920s and 30s. They'd say it doesn't make any sense that the offensive line like opened up these holes that were like 5 people wide. Like it just doesn't, the sport doesn't work that way. And so reviewers very much were paying this very careful attention to the gameplay. And they were really ready to pounce on if the gameplay didn't make sense within these films. But it wasn't just the gameplay. They also did, going back to the question, they paid a lot of attention to the production design as well. So it was both the gameplay, but they also were, paying attention to, and they noted in the reviews, things like, for example, the way that production designers were able to accurately reproduce uniforms from the time, or accurately able to reproduce locations. They would pay attention to, for example, if football players who the audience might recognize appeared in the film. Mm-hmm. So it was both things. And so, I mean, again, there are these, striking comparisons to today. We still look for all these sorts of things. Reviews still look at this, both the gameplay as well as the verisimilitude in the production design, even though then the end product looks so different, even though the sporting action looks so different, so many of the way that they were talked about was similar, which again really points to the way that how we construct that realism might have some underlying constants, but also evolves over time.
Yeah, I didn't get to see any footage of Over the Goal, but I got to see a little bit of College Coach, and they had a football sequence, and you can see what you're talking about, where you have a receiver that's running down, and then they do a shot of him, and there's absolutely no one within 10 yards of him anywhere, and he certainly wasn't running that fast when they had the wide angle. So yeah, I do think that is interesting how you can dissect it both in terms of the actual gameplay sequence and tactics they use, but also how the producers and the editors can kind of create that realistic sequence, if you will, which I guess speaks more to the magic of editing than it does the actual directing.
Yeah, I mean, in College Coach too, I mean, it wasn't just the gameplay. So like reviewers also noted that one of the stars of the film was more associated with other genres, like musicals. And they're like, oh, well, this doesn't he doesn't quite fit in this film. Like, we don't buy him as an athlete.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, again, all these things coming together in a very similar way as a lot of the contemporary discourses around sporting realism, even if the action itself might look quite different.
Yeah. Well, Newt Rocking is kind of the movie where Warner Brothers wants to correct all the mistakes that they made with football films in the past. And based off your research, do you think this was like the first time a university had actually collaborated with an athletic department to kind of create a film like this?
So, I mean, New Rockney All-American was certainly unique, particularly for the close collaboration between the University of Notre Dame and filmmakers. If I'm remembering correctly, University of Notre Dame has been very selective in terms of what filmmakers they work with, who they cooperate with, in terms of their involvement in getting basically the university behind the film. And so Newt Rockney, All-American, the Warner Brothers film, I mean, it had that full support. I mean, the university was in constant contact with the filmmakers, and that really stood out. And going through that archival material is all the kind of back and forth. Basically, they're being like a university liaison to the film, and so that was relatively unique. How much University of Notre Dame was involved. Now, more broadly beyond that, speaking to other universities, I do think. I didn't specifically look into this, but there's certainly traces of there being other collaborations between universities and filmmakers in terms of these college football films. So I noticed, for example, that it kept coming up in some of these boxes. Like, I kept seeing references to the University of Southern California in tons of these boxes, devoted to these football films. And, a lot of that is just basically University of Southern California being in Los Angeles and being near the Hollywood studios is it seemed that filmmakers would turn to the USC football players to appear in their football films, and the kind of the background is extras as kind of the football players. They would use the USC facilities along the way. So I think I remember. This is getting a little while ago, but I think I also remember references to UCLA in some of these boxes. And so I don't know how official the collaboration was between these universities and the filmmakers, but it certainly seems like they were looking toward these university resources when they could to try to make these college football films feel as accurate and as faithful to the context as possible, even if it was limited and mainly being, the LA area schools. But what made, in particular, again, Newt Rockney unique was Notre Dame getting so involved. In particular, I think there's a longer history of them being reticent to work with filmmakers, to use the campus and to use their facilities and to, kind of get involved. So it was basically, this. I think their history is like they're heavily involved in Newt Rockney All-American, and then again for Rudy. But for the most part had brushed off any sort of overtures from filmmakers. But I think, the at least it seems from the boxes that a school like USC was less selective, but that fits with kind of more broadly. USC as a school long had a really close relationship with Hollywood. I mean, it's no mistake. I was doing this research while a USC student at the Warner Brother Archives across the street from USC. So kind of no coincidence in some ways there. But yeah, particularly Newt Rockney, the Notre Dame connection being unique.
Were there any hurdles for any of the extras from UCLA or USC to overcome from the NCAA to be in the film? Because it seemed like the purity standard that the NCAA outwardly projects would kind of run into conflict with college kids being in a film, that there might be some unwritten business aspect, if you would. So is there any hurdles for them to overcome in that sense?
Well, that's a great question. And something that I wasn't really thinking about at the time of my research. So I don't really have a good answer for that. And, even the boxes, I remember thinking it was a little vague whether they were, some of them, if I'm remembering correctly, now having been in these boxes almost a decade ago, whether they were talking about current USC students or recently graduated, USC students. And so there, I remember there being a little ambiguity on that. So that's a good question, but I don't know. I don't know if, that relationship that appeared to be there for the football films was something that would not have flown later.
Right. And Pat O'Brien plays Newt Rockne in the film, and he was the head coach and college coach about 8 or 9 years earlier. And you mentioned how in College Coach they had used his football background in the messaging and the marketing for the film, and that they did it again in Newt Rockne. But it seems to me that the audience wouldn't fall for the same trick twice. If they say, "Oh, check out, he has a football background, it's going to be perfect for this movie," and then they're disappointed because it's not a realistic, or the football action isn't realistic. So do they change their messaging for Pat O'Brien's background and Newt Rockne as opposed to College Coach?
Yeah, well, certainly if I'm remembering correctly, the marketing emphasis was a little bit different. I mean, New Rockne All-American had so much to grab onto in terms of its marketing. A hugely famous, American icon at the time, the close involvement of the University of Notre Dame. So they were really able to, highlight some other aspects of the filmmaking, and they had some other football bona fides they're able to grab onto in that marketing as well. Whereas I think earlier on with a film like College Coach, there's maybe a little less that they could grab onto for that verisimilitude and for that connection they were trying to draw with the real world of college football. New Rockne All-American, they have no shortage kind of options to refer to. I mean, I think I mentioned in the article also, they played up that they had these football consultants who had been there during, New Rockne's heyday. So they were pulling out all these other things. So, I think as having all these sort of other alternative routes to brand the film, they didn't need to use the Pat O'Brien background as much. But I mean, what's so interesting about that is it speaks to this longer history of how these marketers, again, to go back to some of the things talking about before, how eager they were to draw these close associations between the real world of college football in their films. And they would, look for any tactic possible in order to try to brand these films, in order to try to sell these films as providing this realistic connection to college football, whether in the gameplay, whether in the figures who were involved in college football. And so how they went about doing that would change from film to film, and they would kind of make use of whatever they had, whether it was the extras, whether it was the production design, whether it was the gameplay, whether it was, where they filmed. I mean, it really depended on the film, but no matter what, it was a through line that they wanted to make these films feel like they were really closely grounded, concretely grounded in those details of college football at the time.
Well, one tactic that you talk about that I thought was interesting was how they would incorporate real news, real footage in the actual films. And I personally like it whenever filmmakers incorporate real footage, but it also seems to me like, in a sense, it would defeat the purpose of having to go through all that whole trouble of making sure that the production team and the stars and having technical advisors to make sure the action looks real, and then you just splice in real action. So was this a strategy that the executives had put in there just to throw everything at the wall, or was it something they thought was still a necessity after watching the dailies or the reels and thinking this still isn't really where we want it to be yet?
Yeah, well, I mean, you speak to something, it's one of the most jarring things for a modern audience now to go back and look at some of these earlier football films, is to go back and see, basically, if they cut to an action sequence, sometimes they would cut to actual newsreel footage from games of the time. And you can think about, in particular, the way these newsreels were used, you can think about how strange it might be if a film today, like if you were watching Friday Night Lights and in the middle of setting up to a game, then it cut to some, footage of a high school football game, mm-hmm. how strange that might seem, of a real high school football game. But that really speaks to how much the context has changed. Like we were talking about before, newsreel footage was one of the ways that audiences were consuming, football action. One of the, the main exposures that they had to football action, looking at basically those earlier versions of highlights, of going into the theater and seeing that newsreel footage highlighting key moments from the games. And so for studio executives, putting newsreels into these football films was not any sort of radical kind of idea. It was just kind of one of many things in their toolkit that they could turn to in order to put some game action into their films, because they knew that audience members would look at that newsreel footage and say that that's what the game looked like. They knew that they wouldn't have problems there. And so I think they saw these all as different avenues in order to, again, that theme we've been talking about of creating that grounded connection to the actual real world of college football. All these things are avenues. They could use newsreel footage. They could, in their own sporting action, they could, accurately recreate the uniforms and the locations and hire extras and gameplay. All these were, different viable solutions. And again, just going back, so much grounded in that particular context of the time. But, again, certainly that's one of those things, as a contemporary audience that really stands out when you sometimes go back, watch an older football film, is when, now how much it stands out when they put in that real newsreel footage, where instead of having that, simulated, recreated footage, but at the time, just basically part of the arsenal of options that you could use.
Right. Well, that was an option that you point out that wasn't available for the next film, which was Jim Thorpe All-American, because it was a story that took place earlier in the century. I think it was 1907, whenever it took place. And there were some rule changes, obviously, that were much different from 1940 as opposed to 1907. So what was the process like for the research team going out and trying to find out what the game was like from that time period? Because obviously you can have still images that show you certain formations, but you're not necessarily going to see how those plays would play out in a game or a real life sequence.
Yeah. So, like we were, just talking about, and as you set up, so most, college football films were set, in the kind of contemporary college football environment. And so they were basically just trying to recreate what audience members were seeing, every day or every week in the football stadiums. And, thus it made sense to turn to newsreels, even recent newsreels. If you had like a Newt Rockne All-American that was set, a couple decades before, as opposed to what we're just talking about right now with Jim Thorpe All-American, which was set before there was footage available for these games. And so when they were making Jim Thorpe All-American, they, like you mentioned, they drew on things like, for example, they looked at pictures of these earlier games. They talked to people who were there. So they mentioned the memos, for example, interviews, basically they were doing with the people who were there, basically part of Jim Thorpe's life, as part of that collection process. And so what that meant you got then in Jim Thorpe All-American then was this recreation of that earlier form of football. So the thing that really stood out to me, and something then I, was surprised to then also see come up in the memos, was you go and you watch Jim Thorpe All-American, the earliest sequences in that film feature a checkerboard painted field. And I remember watching that going, well, what's that all about? But then you go into the memos and you see all the kind of back and forth amongst the studio executives, making sure they got right that, at this point in time, when he was playing here, they would have been using a checkerboard painted field. And it's only later they phased that out. And so again, they drew on interviews with people who were there, but again, also referring back to just even as simply as looking at pictures, for example, that they had of earlier football games. All these things informed their research. And so, again, speaking to the importance really here of production design and into the details that went into recreating uniforms, recreating locations, making sure all these little details, felt right. Because again, realism was such a huge part of the thrust of these films, counter to, again, that temptation it might be to go back and look at these films and say, this looks awful, this looks unrealistic, this clearly so much thought and attention went into getting these, little things right. And that's why they, went to the trouble of going into these things. And this is why it's, so notable that the studios had these research departments that were, really invested in doing this. And this was their job, was really to go and to nail these little details, whether you were making a football film, whether you were making a Western, whatever your genre was, you put your research department to work to go find out however they could what these little details were.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting too how they had in the rule back whenever I think it was before hash marks, whenever you were tackled, and then you had to snap the ball from wherever you were tackled. So if it was like on the sideline, you had to move it like a yard. I thought that was cool how they recreated that. But it's something I thought that was interesting when talking about Jim Thorpe specifically is you talk about like the physicality that was messaged in the trailers about how physical the practices were for the film and everything like that. And I'm curious, was this a strategy that they used to focus on the physicality because maybe they weren't confident that consumers or that the viewers were going to buy into that brand of football as being realistic for that time? Because I imagine this is a movie that probably drew a lot of younger people and not just people who were alive during Jim Thorpe's time. So was the physicality something they relied more heavily on than the realism of the gameplay at the time?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. It certainly invites some speculation as to the origins. I think some might have been enrooted in what we were just talking about before. The fact that they were making all the gameplay up from scratch, and so they couldn't rely on, for example, newsreels. And so one of the ways to make that gameplay that they were completely simulating filming, be signaled as basically realistic as possible was to signal that, they were basically playing football on set, that these weren't just, actors, simulating throwing balls, that they were basically having, full out, injury filled scrimmages and practices on set. And so that could help compensate for the fact that they're missing maybe some of these other Arsenal members of the Arsenal that they could otherwise turn to. So I think it's indicative of that. But yeah, I certainly think, it could also be related to specifically, signaling that time period and signaling particularly that specificity of the era. But yeah, I do think there's some speculation has to go into kind of figuring that one out.
Right. As far as like sports media as a whole, I mean, you had a couple papers that were published last year about programming during COVID, how a lot of sports channels, it wasn't so much that they reinvented the wheel here. They were just using a lot of, old methods, like having a lot of talk programs that were centered around various documentaries or reflecting on past sports and things of that nature. But I'm curious, do you think that replay programming could find a real presence on linear television again in the same way that ESPN classics used to have? And when I mean like replay programming, I'm not talking about just having like the past weekend's games that you might have missed or having like the top games of 2020. I'm talking about like carefully curated replay programming. Do you think that there's something for that still in linear television?
Yeah. So, I mean, this article that you mentioned, so I wrote this in response to in the midst of the beginning of the pandemic, as you were mentioning, the network started turning to these other sorts of tactics to fill their programming schedules because they didn't have live games because they had been, suspended and canceled. And so they had to look for other ways to fill all those many hours of the schedule. And so they started turning documentaries. And I wrote in particular to response was at the time, in those couple of weeks after the network started, scrambling to fill their schedules, there started to be a lot of responses out there in the popular media basically saying like, oh, look at what these networks are doing that they've never done before. They're showing replays of old games. They're putting documentaries on, all these, kind of, radical things that they've never done before. And then so basically what I was trying to do in the article was point out that, networks have long done these things. They've long turned to documentaries to fill out their schedules. They've long, used event replays in various points in their schedule, particularly in some of their secondary cable outlets. They've long turned to talk programming, transactional programming, all of these things. So you want to make the point that it was not necessarily radical. But one thing that it was hard not to conclude in this article was that this programming, well, necessary because they basically didn't have anything else to turn to. This was all that they could put on TV without endangering anyone. Basically the only viable programming solution. It didn't do very well in terms of ratings. Even the successes that they're having at the time were absolutely, fractional ratings numbers compared to what they typically drew with live event programming, in particular too, the shoulder programming that surrounds live event programming. And so all that leads me to believe that in particular of the programming strategies they tried, I think event replays have the hardest time fitting their way into particularly a flagship channel's typical programming schedule, even if tightly curated. and so, I think in some ways that little moment of time proved a little bit of a testing ground. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of speculation, maybe this will signal a resurgence of event replays. Maybe these will come back. Maybe these will, people are realizing again how much they enjoy them. And, again, people, were at the time doing things like live tweeting games from previous decades and getting into that. Right. But I do think, as much as it was exciting in that moment, and there was, all this, talk of resurgence, I think the reason we haven't seen as much of it since, certainly not to anywhere near the same degree, is because, those numbers were not particularly great. So I'm a little bit skeptical of them into the future. Some of the other tactics they turn to, I think, will continue to be a huge part of schedules. Like they will have to continue using talk programming, and documentaries will always make sense for them because they're ways of mining basically that content they already have, but with slightly new additional content, and then they can run it basically forever. But I do have some skepticism about event replays going forward. Were you more optimistic about them?
Well, a part of me thinks that maybe the ratings were so low was just because we were right in the midst of a pandemic. So everybody's going to be tuning into the news, I think, a lot more often, even if you're not if you're not like a frequent news watcher. I can't say that I'm really that optimistic though, because, and for the people who have heard me say this for the 100th time, I apologize, but I watch a lot of old games on YouTube and I can kind of curate it myself. I mean, I do think it is interesting. Like if there was really good, careful themes that programmers would use, like if they wanted to do a programming stunt based around like coaching rivalries, right? And they had like, the best Tom Landry, Vince Lombardi matchups, that would be something I would definitely tune in to watch. But it just seems like, with all these games available on YouTube, that's actually has decreased my consumption of like talk shows and radio programs and stuff like that, because I get the actual game itself, which is what I would prefer, not so much the commentary behind it. So as far as linear television, it just doesn't seem to me like it would be really worth the investment, because like you mentioned, the secondary cable programs, they eventually just become dump off programs, which is unfortunate because ESPN Classics, I think, has a really great opportunity to serve, as that one source of classic or vintage sports programming. But then it goes to the wayside because they just pretty much dump off the games that you might have missed last week on the channel.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see it as a viable, certainly kind of a stream within. If you think about the over the top services going forward, I can see these kind of tightly curated playlists within an ESPN Plus, or whatever the other future services will be going forward, but seeing those having a place there. So it's doing some of the work that you have to do yourself, finding them on YouTube, it kind of putting them all there in the best kind of format possible, the best resolution possible, and kind of giving you everything in that one spot. So I certainly see it as having a place going forward, but just that skepticism of the particularly its place on linear programming.
Well, and also to that effect too, I mean, I currently work for a company that has a few television networks that focus on vintage television shows and movies. And I used to work for Turner Classic Movies, which essentially the entire network is based on syndicated old films. But I think the thing is, you're not necessarily going to find a lot of those programs on streaming services per se. I mean, because HBO Max has access to the Warner Brothers library, you might find a little more than you would say on Netflix or on Disney Plus, because they own Fox, might have something. But I do think that vintage programming is really good suited for linear television. It just seems like you have to put a good theme behind it, and I guess just given all the options, it's really difficult for people to maybe search it out deliberately. I mean, maybe in the off seasons, I think that might be something really good too, because like I mentioned earlier, I mean, I don't really watch a lot of talk programming anymore since I've really discovered these games on YouTube. And the same thing goes with the draft. I mean, I can only listen to you guys talk about who's going to draft which team for so long before I'm like, okay, like I have no control over this. So let me just watch the game, Yeah.
No, in the comparison to TCM is really interesting. I mean, as someone who feels like that's almost like a national service that like we need is TCM. Like being such a huge part of being a film scholar, feeling like I need that. Yeah, the comparison is interesting, how to pull that off with the same vitality that it feels like TCM has.
Yeah. The last question I have in pertaining to programming, I guess just to wrap this up, is you wrote another paper about alternative telecast for games, like having coaches talk about the game as it's happening, or like the Payne and Eli. That wasn't part of the essay, but that's the same idea. And I kind of share your sentiments too about like it's kind of fragmenting the viewers, although it's going to be still focused on the same game in and of itself. But do you think that, number one, is this just a novelty for the moment, or do you see it having a long-term future? And do you think that this is an opportunity to kind of transform live sports television into something that's more auteur driven in a way? Because you mentioned in like documentaries, like with 30 for 30, that you can have a little more experimentation and have a little bit more of that director's vision. But as far as live sports programming, I personally think there's a huge opportunity. And I was wondering if you think that these sort of alternative telecasts, if they do survive the test of time, could provide some more experiments and challenges to the conventional live sports broadcasting.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wrote that article out of being intrigued by it as a viewer. I had watched the statistics focused alternative telecasts that they'd done around baseball, and I found them kind of for myself more intriguing than the main telecast. And so I do find them these intriguing places to experiment and to think about other ways of covering games. And so I actually, last year I actually was really excited. I watched the Nickelodeon alternative telecast of the wild card game. Mm-hmm. And, even though it was geared toward kids and families, I still thought that it made for a really intriguing place to experiment with some other ways of talking about games, of covering them in slightly different ways. So I do think there's a place from going forward as a way of particularly kind of like being these like almost like a sandbox in which to kind of play around with some different things. Because what I found was I was reading so much of the coverage around, particularly that there's a lot of writing around that Nickelodeon telecast. I was finding that people were really excited by it, particularly because I think a lot of people had grown kind of bored with what we're used to now with the typical standard flagship telecast, that it feels a little formulaic. Sometimes it feels like overly cliched at time, like we've heard the same analysis offered in slightly different ways. And so there's a lot of excitement around rethinking that traditional formula, even if, you don't think the way forward is slime cannons and like player fun facts about their favorite animals. Mm-hmm. But just the idea of thinking of alternatives to that standard formula being exciting. So I do think as a place for experimentation, they're quite intriguing. And so I do think we'll keep seeing experiments into the future. And I have wondered for myself what this kind of what are those alternatives? Because I think for myself, if I was a sports telecast auteur, what would I emphasize in the coverage? What would I do differently? And I don't know that I could come up with anything that much different, but it's still just exciting to think about. So yeah, I think there are certainly a place for them going forward, even if they'll continue to be few and far between. But as I mentioned in the article, it does make me in some ways a little bit sad, so like I've tried watching a couple of times the Manning brother telecast, and I don't particularly love it. And so I've gone back to the primary telecast. But then one of the things I most love about watching any major sporting event is being on social media and seeing live reaction, seeing, what other people are experiencing about the game. And so it's kind of sad when I go back to the primary telecast and all the tweets I'm seeing are about something that happened on the Manning one. And then I feel like I'm missing out. And so it's no longer feels like this big event that everyone's watching in the same way. It does feel fractured, and that does make me feel a little sad, even if I am excited by the possibilities of what can be done with these. And, these, I'm sure they'll keep coming up with things, so I also watched the basketball one recently that was like a Marvel superhero theme one. Although I think they made that the primary telecast, not a alternative telecast, but I don't think that's the future. But yeah, I'm intrigued to see where it goes.
Yeah, it does feel like this double-edged sword because you mentioned how it's supposed to complement the primary broadcast, not replace it. But it does always feel like there could be, if there ever was one that struck fire, it could kind of create the zero-sum game where you're taking away from the primary broadcast. I mean, to your point about like what could you actually do to put that auteur stamp on it. I mean, whenever the NFL had their 100th year anniversary season, like the opening game, like Al Michaels and Chris Collinsworth had like the top hats on, fedoras for making like their 1920s journalists and stuff like that. Like stuff like that I think would have been fun if they did that throughout the season. Like say if it was, I don't know, a game between the Steelers and the Raiders, an old 1970s rivalry. You could use like 70s graphics in one quarter, do something like that. It doesn't have to be anything revolutionary, but maybe use like a 70s soundtrack when you're going in and out of commercial break. Maybe use your promos as like a way to kind of get that aesthetic and that vibe going. And I just kind of feel like there was a missed opportunity. And I feel like if there was a telecast that did do stunts like that, I would much rather watch that as opposed to the traditional broadcast.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think it goes back, and I even looked at reactions from people in the industry who make sports television. I was on a workshop at the sports video group, and again, that Nickelodeon telecast, there's so much excitement, I think, just by the idea of experimenting with what everyone's used to, and I'm excited to see where that enthusiasm for experimentation leads people in the future. And hopefully there's more room to experiment with the idea of there being these alternative streams available to them.
Yeah, certainly. Well, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you on either social media or on the web to read any of the stuff that you've written?
Yeah, I guess most of my scholarship is on my personal website. It's bwbuehler.com, bwbuehler.com. You can download all the PDFs of my scholarship there. And so I guess it's the main way. I'm used to referring everything through like my Google Scholar page, but I think my personal website's easier to manage here. So yeah, I'll leave with that. That'll be my plug.
Yeah, that's actually how I found you. All right, man. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. This was very informative and fun and good to talk a little media business and a lot of fun talking movies and football as well. So I appreciate you taking the time and I'm looking forward to seeing what you write next, man.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.